Who are you really? The person you were yesterday? Or someone completely different? Most people would say they remain themselves throughout their entire life. But the Portuguese genius Fernando Pessoa saw this completely differently. He didn't just write under pseudonyms. He literally became other people, each with their own biography, handwriting, and philosophy. Pessoa proved, your I is an illusion, a dangerous fairy tale we believe in because the truth scares us to the bone. What if a unified you never existed? Get comfortable, my friend. We're beginning a fascinating journey. But first, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. We're starting. Part 1. Here's a pretty standard tale people like to tell about who we are. You enter the world, grow up to develop a personality, make choices that show your true colors, and through all of this, you remain the same you. It's like there's this steady and ongoing identity, some magical thread tying together the kid you were with, the adult you become. Big minds like Descartes, Kant, and Husserl have crafted entire philosophies around this idea. Psychologists latch onto it, and our legal system depends on it. Society overall needs to believe that the person who gets arrested today is the same individual appearing before a judge later. But then there's Pessoa, who peered into this narrative and called it nonsense, not in some artsy or symbolic way, but as a straight-up falsehood. He saw it as a dangerous delusion we hold on to because admitting the truth sends chills down our spines. To tear down this facade, he came up with something called the heteronym method. By creating and fully embodying different personas, he wanted to illustrate that identity isn't something you discover. It's something you construct. It's more like putting on a show than possessing a core being, more diverse than uniform. Take Alberto Cairo, for instance, whom Pessoa regarded as his mentor. Born in Lisbon in 1889, Cairo spent most of his life in the rural parts, with only a modest education. Supposedly, he knew next to nothing about literature or philosophy. His poetry, centered on pure experiences, avoids explanations. When Cairo notices a flower, it's just that, a flower. No metaphors, no symbolism, nothing lurking beneath the surface. Just the unfiltered encounter of color and shape. His most famous work, The Keeper of Sheep, sheds light with lines like, "To think is to not understand." In Cairo's realm, philosophy erects walls between our minds and reality. What we really need is to shed everything that keeps us from direct experience. Now, let's meet Ricardo Reis, another of Pessoa's creations, viewed as a disciple of Cairo, but philosophically different. Reis was born in Porto in 1887, attended a Jesuit-run medical school, and eventually escaped to Brazil because his loyalty to the monarchy clashed with the new Portuguese Republic. He produced sophisticated odes inspired by classical Latin and Greek works, leaning on figures like Horace and the Stoics. While Cairo focuses on living in the moment, Reis obsesses over destiny, death, and the futility of resistance. His philosophy is all about accepting whatever happens with serenity, enjoying life's fleeting pleasures in moderation, and not deceiving oneself into thinking they can alter fate. Life, he believes, is predetermined. Fighting against it is pointless. Those who are wise learn to keep a cool head about things that can't be changed. Then we have Álvaro de Campos, the energetic dynamo of the group. Campos was born in Tavira in 1890 and moved on to study engineering in both naval and mechanical fields in Glasgow. He traveled extensively, crafting passionate free verse inspired by Walt Whitman and Italian futurism. Early on, his pieces like Triumphal Ode and Maritime Ode are fueled by a desire to experience everything at once. It's a crazy sort of longing. "I want to be drunk on everything," he declares, craving to feel every emotion in every conceivable way. But as time rolls on, his writing descends into profound depression and deep existential despair, spotlighted by isolation from modern society, other people, and even himself. Through these heteronyms, Pessoa didn't just spin variations on a theme, he gave life to radically opposing worldviews within a single individual. Cairo just tosses aside any form of thinking. Reyes dives deep into Stoic philosophy. Meanwhile, Campos is all over the place with his mood swings. One is soaking up nature, another is all about ancient cultures, and the third is wrapped up in the hustle and bustle of modern industry. You've got one writing in simple Portuguese sprinkled with errors, another in elegant classical prose, and the last with a chaotic modernist style. They each have their own birthdays, life stories, handwriting, and signatures. The outcome of this? Absolutely mind-blowing. Picture someone who doesn't just pretend, but actually lives as different people, each producing their own unique works. What does that say about our own identity? Most people would think Pessoa was just exploring different ideas by wearing various masks. But Pessoa disagreed. He insisted that his alternative selves, which he called heteronyms, weren't mere covers. They were full-fledged identities he embodied completely. When he wrote as Cairo, he became Cairo. The Fernando Pessoa we know was no more real than any of the others. In fact, it might have been the least genuine, as it bundled all these identities into one fake package. This whole concept is linked to sensationism, a philosophy Pessoa devised in his 20s. It's like taking what's known in empirical philosophy, giving it a twist, and tuning it up. His main idea? Everything begins and ends with what we can sense. Not the cerebral stuff, like thoughts or logic, but direct sensory experience. Every concept, belief, and self stems from feelings and senses. Art or philosophy only gets real when it comes back to these tangible experiences. Anything else is like it's floating without any grounding. But Pessoa cranked this up a notch beyond typical empiricism. To him, sensations weren't just passively absorbed. They could be sharpened and transformed into art. Each of the characters he created, these heteronyms, viewed the world through their own sensory lens. Cairo embraced direct sensation without thinking too much. Reyes looked at things firmly, stoically. Campos pushed his experiences to overdrive. By breaking himself into these distinct characters, Pessoa demonstrated multiple ways of interacting with reality. This wasn't just a literary pursuit. It was a deep dive into varied consciousness, proving that having multiple selves was strategically enriching, not chaotic. Most people view life through a single lens, but Pessoa believed that embracing multiple perspectives could free us from the idea of one fixed identity. Of course, this raises some complications, especially practical ones. If our identity is just a mix of different selves, how do we manage day-to-day life seamlessly? Pessoa himself struggled with this. He worked as a translator, lived a solitary life, barely published while he lived, and died at 47 from cirrhosis. His personal life was pretty much empty. He had one serious romantic connection with Ophelia Quiros, but it crumbled because he couldn't emotionally sustain it. Which of his identities loved her? Which would stick around? While shifting identities fueled his creativity, it made normal human relationships tricky. And then there's the tricky subject of responsibility. If there's no constant self, who's accountable when things go wrong? Our legal and moral systems rely on the notion of a stable person. But if someone is always shifting, it's tough to find responsibility. Pessoa acknowledged this problem in his work, but didn't have a solution. His view of human identity might be more truthful than traditional ones, but it doesn't provide guidance on how to tackle ethics or justice. So, let's talk about communication for a second. When Pessoa wrote as Cairo, Reis, or Campos, who was the actual voice behind the words? Readers find themselves holding the book, puzzled about who's really speaking to them. Critics can't get enough of debating whether these pseudonyms echo Pessoa's own views or completely oppose them. The truth isn't black and white, it's probably a bit of both. This makes the whole conversation tricky. For communication to work right, we've got to trust that the person we're chatting with now is going to be the same one who gets back to us later. With these heteronyms, that trust flies right out the window. Now, let's dive into the big one. Is our mind really working the way some theories claim? Looking at recent studies in psychology and neuroscience, you'd notice, sure, people do flip between mental states and deal with clashing beliefs. But there's this constant brain activity going on, a merging of memories, and this ongoing self-narrative that keeps our identity fairly stable as time ticks by. Take dissociative identity disorder, known in the past as multiple personality disorder. It's seen as a challenge because that usual blend isn't there. Pessoa might argue that the real problem is trying too hard to force this integration, suggesting folks struggle because they're holding on to one fixed sense of self for dear life. But that debate is still wide open. Then there's the question: did Pessoa genuinely buy into his own philosophy, or was he just super savvy with his artistic tricks? Some folks reckon he really lived through his different personas, with the heteronyms truly representing different sides of him. Others are convinced it was all a strategic act, with Pessoa skillfully pulling the strings. There's proof for both camps. Like on March 8, 1914, Pessoa described a triumphal day where a character named Cairo just sprang to life in his mind, leading him to write 30 poems in a flash. Sounds like a spontaneous moment, right? But then again, Pessoa also wrote detailed theories on sensationism and mapped out how these heteronyms would interact, which suggests a lot of planning. Exploring Pessoa's thoughts on identity reveals some unsettling truths about what it means to be human, while also showing the cracks in his theories. It's true that who we are is more fluid and constructed than we typically admit. We're complex, contradictory beings. Our sense of a cohesive self partially leans on the stories we tell ourselves and the memories we hold. Yet, living like we're entirely split into separate parts doesn't add up. We need continuity to form relationships, take responsibility for our actions, and manage time. Being completely fragmented would lead us into isolation and chaos. This tug of war between understanding life's deeper meanings and running into their limits runs through everything Pessoa created. He had a profound insight into identity, But that understanding made everyday living a challenge, as his heteronyms showed both his brilliance and his existential struggle, capturing his theories even as they pulled him apart. Part 2. The Book of Disquiet. He does most of this exploration through his alter ego, Bernardo Suarez. This substantial work is all fragmented bits that were left to collect dust in a trunk for years after Pessoa died. It's a massive collection with over 400 pieces. Some are short paragraphs, while others stretch on for pages. No main storyline, no clear-cut structure, and definitely no clean conclusion. Just continuous deep dives into the meaning of existence. Suarez comes across as a humble guy, an assistant bookkeeper at a fabric shop in Lisbon, living in an unremarkable rented room and doing his day-to-day tasks. On the surface, his life looks pretty empty. But oh, his inner world! It's bursting with deep reflections on all aspects of being. The aha moment hits pretty early in the book. You read, "I was someone else for quite a chunk of my life, from when I was just starting out, and suddenly, slam, I've woken up in the middle of a bridge, looking down at a river below, feeling more real than I ever knew." This line captures Pessoa's take on reality and illusion. The so-called real world, with our jobs, relationships, all of that, is like we're on autopilot, part of a mass illusion we don't even realize we're part of. The real reality, that's those rare moments of intense self-awareness, seeing yourself as you truly are. Those bursts can be a lot to handle, though. Suarez writes, "Not knowing yourself means you're living. Only slightly knowing yourself means you're thinking. Catching a glimpse of yourself as I did? It's touching the deepest essence of your soul. And that light? It's so intense, it burns away everything, even who you think you are." Switching up Socrates' famous advice to know thyself, Pessoa flips it on its head. For Socrates, understanding oneself was the path to wisdom. But for Pessoa, it's like staring into the abyss. The clearer you see yourself, the more you realize what's really there isn't much. Just a series of fleeting emotions and thoughts that we've strung together, calling it me. To function day to day, a certain amount of ignorance is necessary. Someone completely tuned into their inner self? They'd be paralyzed by it. Pessoa also had some strong feelings about how literature relates to living. A lot of folks see literature as something that comes second to life. It's either mirroring or shadowing what we know as reality. You go about your life, and then you write based on those experiences. Experience is seen as the original, writing as the copy. Pessoa turns this concept upside down. To him, writing is actually more real than living. Suarez puts it bluntly. Writing is forgetting. Literature is the coziest way to ignore life. This isn't about escape. It's something bolder. Everyday life? It's mindless and habitual, done without much thought. Writing jolts you back to full attention. It makes you zoom in on life's details. When you're writing, you capture parts of reality you might have missed while just living it. The way the Book of Disquiet is all over the place, format-wise, mirrors this philosophy perfectly. Typically, stories have beginnings, middles, and ends. They're all about cohesion and unfolding events. But Pessoa? He saw human life as inherently disjointed. Each moment just stands there, separate from what came before and what follows. Memory tricks us, creating a storyline to add a false sense of flow to random events. Disquiet's scatterbrained structure tackles this misleading flow head-on. Every fragment stands solo. There's no gearing up to something grand, no conclusion, just one vivid slice of awareness after the next. Consider this line. I'm always kind of floored when I finish something, surprised and, honestly, a little down about it. My need to make sure everything's just right should technically mean I'd never wrap up any project. Heck, I shouldn't even be able to get one off the ground. That's kind of what Pessoa is getting at when it comes to doing things. To take any action, you've got to believe it has worth, think the results matter, and trust that your current hard work will pay off later. But if life's just a made-up tale and we're always changing, what's the point of doing anything? Why bother putting in the effort today for some version of you that's here tomorrow? Chasing perfection becomes kind of worthless since there's no unchanging you to hit that mark. This is what folks refer to as Pessoa's paralysis problem. His insights are spot on in describing life's experience, but then make you feel stuck about how to actually live in the world. Suarez mostly hangs out in his own head. Things happening around him barely register. I'm always living in the present, he points out. The future? Who knows? The past? It's over. The future feels overwhelming with all its endless options, and the past feels heavy with its emptiness. Without a clear past or future, or a belief in continuity and results, what remains is a sharp awareness of the present moment. This is fascinating from a philosophical angle, but a nightmare in real life. The Book of Disquiet delves into what you might call Pessoa's take on everyday life. While thinkers like Husserl or Heidegger might dive into big-picture questions about consciousness, Pessoa zoomed in on the nitty-gritty of daily living. Suarez paints a vivid picture of the afternoon sun in Lisbon, the monotony of office life, observing people at cafes, and how Sunday afternoons feel empty. These detailed looks make regular life seem both strange and significant. I feel like I'm always on the verge of waking up, Suarez muses. I'm in this sleepy half-dream state, like my soul is dreaming me. This suggests we're living in a kind of dream, assuming we're awake, aware, and making decisions when really we're just coasting along without noticing. Truly waking up would mean recognizing this dream state and realizing everything we consider real might not be. Yet, we might never be fully awake because our consciousness relies on a bit of self-deception to get by. Pessoa also offers deep thoughts on how imagination stacks up to reality. Most people think imagination plays second fiddle, creating fake images compared to perception, which gives us real ones. But Pessoa flipped the script. Imagination is more real because it's more conscious. When you perceive, your brain just picks up what's there. But when you imagine, you're crafting an experience. Imagined stuff is more real because it's more intentional and conscious. This changes everything. If the imagined is more real than the lived, unwritten books are more real than written ones. Lives not lived are more genuine than the ones we're living. What could happen is more real than what is happening. Suarez jots down, I've dreamed more than Napoleon ever did. I've embraced more humanity in thought than Christ touched in reality. I came up with philosophies nobody ever set down on paper. These aren't just lofty daydreams. They're ideas on how imagination ranks in the hierarchy of reality. What's in our minds has a greater reality than what exists unconsciously outside. But, of course, this raises issues, mainly how to know what's real. If imagined experiences are more real than the actual ones, how do we separate facts from fantasy? Pessoa might suggest that line is pointless, since all experience is, in a sense, fantasy. The real question isn't whether our experiences are tangible or just figments of our imagination, but rather it's about distinguishing between the fantasies we recognize and those we don't. If you frame it this way, you lose any outside reference point for what is true or not. Everything seems personal, an inner dialogue that defies proof. Philosophy, in turn, takes a hit because it thrives on common ground, a shared reality everyone can discuss. Then you've got solipsism to worry about. If your mental world feels more real than anything outside of it, why bother connecting with others? After all, those other people might just be your imagination's creations. A person standing in front of you feels less genuine than the idea you've crafted of them. This line of thinking leads to a lot of isolated living. Take Fernando Pessoa, for instance. He didn't exactly have a social circle, stayed away from intimate relationships, and spent most of his time lost in his writing. The very ideas that fueled his creativity made it tough for him to engage with life in a conventional way. Then there's the whole value dilemma. If fantasizing about success seems more fulfilling than actually achieving it, what's the use in attempting anything at all? Why draft a book if dreaming about it seems more substantial? What's the point of chasing real-world accomplishments when just thinking about them seems enough? This was Pessoa's lifelong paradox. He left behind a tangle of half-finished works, rarely bringing anything to completion. His philosophical stance made these bits and pieces seem intentional, prioritizing imagined victory over actual achievements. This mindset was self-defeating, making it even challenging for him to fully articulate it. Critics are still debating whether Pessoa truly believed in imagination's supremacy or whether he was just finding ways to rationalize his own shortcomings. In his lifetime, he barely published, gained little attention, and mostly remained in the background. Conveniently, his philosophy made it seem like staying unknown was preferable to fame. Leaving projects unfinished was better than completing them, and inner experiences were more valuable than external accomplishments. Critics argue this isn't philosophy, but a clever justification for himself. Pessoa would likely argue these critics missed the essence since they adhere to values he rejected, but doubts remain. Another puzzling aspect is how his Book of Disquiet tackles authenticity. With a character like Bernardo Soares, who's partially fictional, how much of what's said reflects Pessoa's true beliefs, and how much is merely Soares speaking? Pessoa described Soares as a version of himself stripped of logic and feeling, a fragmented self, in his words. So, does what's left of Soares still represent Pessoa? Or could Pessoa himself be another character of his own creation? The book never gives a definitive answer, as that would demand a set authorial identity, something Pessoa never subscribed to. The charm of the Book of Disquiet is in showing that reality isn't as fixed as it seems. Fiction intertwines with fact, and dreams sit alongside consciousness. Our deepest experiences stem from imagination, not action. Most people coast through life asleep, never fully aware. These are intellectually rich ideas, even if they lead to a disquieting existence. Yet, the book also highlights the drawbacks of radical subjectivity. Yes, our minds shape much of our reality, and imagination colors our experiences. Sure, the notion of a coherent self is overestimated, but if you dismiss external reality entirely, put imagination above real actions, and let your identity scatter, you find yourself in a tough spot for living. Pessoa's life is testament enough to that. His philosophy definitely had some amazing truths woven into it, but it also steered him toward a lonely path, leaving him stuck and ultimately heading toward disaster. The tricky part is figuring out if you can embrace these insights without getting tangled in their pitfalls. Essentially, whether it's doable to peek behind the curtain and still engage with the world around you. Pessoa never found that sweet spot. Perhaps it's just not out there to begin with. Part 3. Pessoa, a literary trailblazer of the 20th century, offered a fresh take on consciousness that shook things up. His concepts not only resonated with the breakthroughs in phenomenology, but also took them a step further, using stories rather than dry academic stuff. His core idea, our consciousness, isn't straightforward. It's more like a puzzle of different viewpoints. It's not a steady eye observing everything, but more like a spinning kaleidoscope of changing perspectives. And when it comes to grasping who we are, it's more of an illusion than the real deal. Now, about self-knowledge, let's kick it off with Socrates. He was all about the belief that knowing yourself was doable and rewarding. You examine your beliefs, your wants, and your character. You reflect on your experiences and what really drives you. Spending time seriously thinking about all that gets you a clear idea of who you are. Later thinkers during the Enlightenment era ran with this idea, suggesting that people have a special insight into their own minds. For Descartes, this was the bedrock. I think, therefore I am. Even if he doubted everything else, the fact that he could doubt meant he couldn't doubt his own existence. For him, being aware of himself was the foundation of all knowledge. Then along comes Pessoa, flipping this whole concept on its head. He claimed that the self we believe we understand is just a fictional story. There isn't a stable self to pin down. Instead, our consciousness is more like a series of fragmented, random episodes that keep forming and disappearing. What we call the self is merely a narrative we construct afterward to make sense of an otherwise chaotic life. To use the words of one of his alter egos, Suarez, I realize I've been a series of mistakes and wrong turns, that I've never truly lived, only existed as a succession of conscious moments and thoughts. When you take a close look, the solid sense of self crumbles, leaving nothing but layers of thoughts observing each other. This links up with how scholars describe Pessoa's exploration of these ideas, even though he didn't label it as phenomenology. Husserl, a major figure in phenomenology, aimed to describe how consciousness appears to us by setting aside questions about the external world to focus on our experience. Pessoa was in the same neighborhood, but a bit bolder. While Husserl was after universal traits common to all consciousness, Pessoa saw a chaotic mess of differences. Husserl spoke of an organizing ego at the heart of experience, while Pessoa found nothing, just empty space where an ego might have been. Consider Pessoa's description of suddenly seeing himself clearly. I'm struck by this sarcastic dread of life, a sorrow so vast it can't fit into my conscious mind. I see that I've got it all wrong, that I haven't lived, merely wasted time by thinking and being aware. This newfound understanding of my real self, always drifting between emotions and observations, hits me like a grim verdict to bear. This moment captures Pessoa's biggest revelation about consciousness. It essentially sidesteps looking directly at itself. Most of the time, being conscious is like being in a state of semi-awareness, just coasting through life. Truly knowing yourself is rare and a bit unsettling. When consciousness really examines itself, it finds there's nothing solid backstage, just continuous change and transition. The unity of consciousness? Just a helpful little story we tell ourselves to keep moving forward. It's pretty fascinating how all this relates to the Buddhist concept of no self, but Pessoa stumbled upon it through a Western lens and his own life journey. In Buddhism, the self is just a big illusion, kept alive by our stubborn clinging and ignorance. The key to freedom is seeing past this illusion to understand the impersonal forces that shape our life experiences. Pessoa landed in a similar spot, but followed a different path. Instead of using meditation like Buddhism suggests to dissolve the illusion of self, he dove into it head first by creating multiple personas or heteronyms. For him, this chaos kindled his creativity. Both ways of thinking admit the self is kind of like a made-up character, but they handle it differently. Pessoa came up with what you might call a philosophy of attention. Attention, he thought, isn't something that just happens to us. It actually shapes what we notice in our minds. Most of us are on autopilot, reacting to things as they hit us. Real consciousness is about being aware of our own awareness, stepping back to watch ourselves think and notice. It's a tough job and can be exhausting, but it's when you really get to grips with your own mind. Pessoa's different personas, or heteronyms, each represent their own unique way of focusing attention. Take Cairo, for example. He's all about pure sense perception without the constant mental noise or labels. He tries to see the world like a child would, before the mess of language and societal expectations muddles everything up. For him, mystery doesn't come from asking questions about the unknown, but from just experiencing it as it is. Cairo's clarity of consciousness comes when thought takes a back seat and pure seeing takes over. Reyes, on the other hand, brings a sort of stoic acceptance to his way of paying attention. He sees everything around him, but remains emotionally detached, looking at joy and sorrow with the same indifferent eye. This detachment is grounded in an understanding of life's fleeting nature and the certainty of death, bringing about a calm, unbothered mindset that looks for nothing more. Rice seems to suggest that keeping your distance from life's ups and downs leads to inner peace. Don't get too caught up in the questions. There's not much point. Then you've got Campos, who charges into life full throttle, longing to feel everything there is to feel all at once. This leads to explosive bursts of energy that eventually crash into deep lows. Early in his work, he talks about wanting to be everyone and experience everything, but constantly pushing consciousness to the brink leaves him empty and tired. Later on, he confesses to feeling like he's no one and will never be anything except for carrying all the dreams of the world. It's a stark reminder that chasing after peak intensity can lead to a sense of emptiness. Together, these three paths demonstrate different ways consciousness can interact with experiences, without thought, with calm acceptance, or by eagerly reaching for everything. Each has its own benefits and pitfalls, telling different truths about being conscious. Pessoa's brilliance was in understanding that no single approach to attention can capture the full range of conscious experience. You need different angles, different selves, different ways to be aware. However, this raises another question. How do all these diverse elements hold together? If consciousness is so varied, how do these different attention strategies align? When Pessoa jumps from one character like Cairo to Race to Campos, something decides which persona takes the stage. But what is making these switches? If there isn't one singular self, who or what is pulling the strings? Pessoa didn't solve this mystery. He did an amazing job capturing the idea of having many sides to the self, but he just couldn't quite nail down how all these sides come together, even for a split second. Scholars have drawn connections between Pessoa's thoughts and various philosophical ideas. Take Nietzsche, for example. He also challenged the idea of a unified self, saying it should be "it thinks" rather than "I think," making consciousness seem more like an impersonal process. Both Nietzsche and Pessoa tossed aside the traditional notion of a singular, logical self, giving more weight to creative will than to logic or deliberate thought. Nietzsche and Pessoa both leaned on a kind of literary philosophical approach instead of giving detailed arguments or reasoning. Nietzsche emphasized self-improvement, encouraging people to reshape themselves through dedication. Pessoa, meanwhile, didn't really push that agenda. Instead, his heteronyms just hang out together, each fully formed and complete on its own. You can see a parallel with William James's psychological take. James compared consciousness to a flowing stream, always in motion, never the same from one second to the next. He didn't buy into the idea of some deeper self behind our experiences and viewed the self as just the most recent thought weaving into past ones. Pessoa agreed with that, but took it a step further. While James saw individuals with a single stream of consciousness, Pessoa brought the idea of multiple streams, showing distinct consciousnesses within a single person. This concept either extends James' thinking or maybe blurs the line between literary flair and psychological truth. Some experts see a link between Pessoa's work and modern consciousness studies or cognitive science. There's this concept called the modular mind hypothesis, which suggests our thinking isn't one unified process, but rather a mix of semi-independent systems handling things like perception, language, memory, and social stuff. Sometimes these systems clash, which might explain why we feel internally conflicted at times. Pessoa's heteronyms could be literary exaggerations of real cognitive processes, pumped up for artistic flair, but rooted in actual mental operations. Or they might be pure invention with no connection to how our minds really work. Evidence doesn't heavily favor one side or the other. One big issue with Pessoa's view on consciousness is it complicates decision-making. If our consciousness is fractured and lacking a solid self at the helm, how do we choose anything? Every decision needs some belief that the decision-maker is the one dealing with the consequences. But with a shaky sense of identity, choices can feel random. Why would today's self make sacrifices for tomorrow's self? Pessoa himself wrestled with this. He famously had trouble making decisions, finding it tough to finish tasks or follow through with plans. He saw the philosophical challenge of decision-making, but didn't suggest practical answers. Another snag is it makes communication tricky. Speaking assumes the person talking has a clear point they want to share, which the listener can grasp. But if there's no consistent speaker, just ever-shifting perspectives and fragments of selves, communication turns into more of a lucky break than an intentional act. You might think you're conveying Cairo's ideas, but then race barges in, Campos misses the memo, and Pessoa himself can't swing in to clarify. What it ultimately means depends on what the reader and writer manage to piece together in the moment. It's imaginative but chaotic, wiping out any chance of stable meaning. One of the biggest puzzles in Pessoa's philosophy is his claim that there's no single, unified self. However, someone had to manage those heteronyms, craft their backstories, assign them poems, and maintain the whole creative setup over time. Doing all that seems to require precisely the kind of unified self he argued doesn't exist. Some might suggest these heteronyms just spontaneously appeared, illustrating Pessoa's diverse self. But even then, there must have been some underlying foundation holding it all together, allowing these personalities to emerge. His philosophy struggles to explain how it stands in the first place. Despite these contradictions, Pessoa's unique perspective on consciousness provides a lot to ponder. Through his ongoing literary exploration, he revealed that consciousness is a lot more intricate and varied than many traditional thinkers acknowledged. Getting to know ourselves isn't just about uncovering some inner truth. It's more like an ongoing cycle where the act of observing actually shapes what we perceive. We often underestimate the role attention plays in shaping our experiences. Instead of being a single self, we're like a collection of different voices and perspectives held together by the narratives we construct for ourselves. These insights remain significant, even if some of his more extreme ideas don't hold water. The real test is whether we can accept the concept of a multifaceted consciousness without concluding that there's no self at all. Can we recognize how identities are crafted while still accepting there's a consistent thread through it all? Can we acknowledge our inner diversity without getting lost in overthinking? Pessoa extensively explored consciousness and realized that heightened self-awareness might not be sustainable. Maybe the solution is finding a balanced awareness, grasping enough about ourselves without being completely transparent. It seems that total self-awareness might not be achievable, not because we lack the capability, but because knowing ourselves too well might hinder our ability to simply be. Part 4. Sensationism was something Pessoa was really passionate about. He wanted to build a solid foundation for modern art. Back in the early 1910s, he got together with his pal, Mario de Sacanero, to develop this new artistic philosophy. They believed in prioritizing senses over rationality, valuing variety instead of uniformity, and focusing on the act of artistic creation rather than just portraying reality as it is. Pessoa wrote a bunch of manifestos and essays on this, but to truly understand sensationism, you've got to see it through the works of his heteronyms. Here's the gist. Art both starts and ends with sensation. It's not about the intellect or emotions, nor about teaching morals or pushing political agendas. It's about raw, sensory experiences. Art isn't just meant to depict the world or convey feelings. It exists to trigger a sensory response from its audience. Traditionally, people thought art should either imitate nature or reveal truth. The romantic view was that it should express the artist's true emotions. Sensationism chucked all that out the window. Art doesn't mimic or express. It's a showcase of pure sensation. This didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It actually draws from and challenges older empiricist ideas. Thinkers like Locke and Hume laid the groundwork, suggesting that all knowledge springs from sensory experiences. Abstract thoughts are basically complex combinations of simple sensory experiences. They argued the mind and its capacity to organize these experiences have no innate content of their own. Pessoa agreed with this up to a point, but he pushed it further in his art. If all knowledge is rooted in sensation and art is a form of knowledge, then art should explore the full spectrum and depth of sensory experiences. So, the highest form of art delivers a rich array of sensations. Pessoa broke it down into 3 parts: sensation, suggestion, and construction. Sensation is the immediate blow to your senses when experiencing art, through sight, sound, touch, or a mix that modernist art often experiments with. Suggestion goes a step further by stirring up associations and emotions that aren't instantly apparent, which in turn intensifies that first sensory punch. Finally, construction is the blueprint behind it all, making sure both the sensory and suggestive aspects work like a charm. This isn't just haphazard expression, it's more like a carefully planned design. Look at how Pessoa's heteronyms bring these concepts to life. Take Cairo, for instance, who's all about direct sensation. His poetry grips onto pure perception, free from personal opinions. The Tagus is more beautiful than the river running through my village. But the Tagus is not more beautiful than the river running through my village, because the Tagus is not the river running through my village. There are no symbols or grand ideas here, just raw experiences, impossible to compare or fit neatly into boxes. Pure sensation, without suggestion or embellishment. On the contrary, Reyes layers his work with suggestion, drawing from classic references and mythology. His verses intricately tie into the cultural heritage of Greece and Rome, making even small details feel profound through associations. Rivers call to mind the Lethe, roses whisper tempus fugit, gods summon entire mythologies. He massively amplifies the sensory punch through suggestion, while also relying heavily on construction. His work sticks to classical forms, filled with measured meters, sophisticated stanza arrangements, and skillful rhetorical flourishes. It all seems effortless, yet it's meticulously crafted. Then there's Campos, who turns up every dial to its highest setting. His grand odes overflow with sensory fireworks, machine noises, urban landscapes, crowded streets, breakneck speeds, gadgets, and mayhem. It's a bursting jumble of sensations that you can hardly sort out. Suggestions soar just as high, with technology, empires, modern life, and decay all crashing into the verse. The chaos might seem unbridled, but it's art in its rawest, most unrestrained form. All right, here's the scoop. You know how some poems might seem like a bunch of random thoughts thrown together? Well, it's not quite like that. It's more like a dance of chaos and control, with a rhythm that speeds up and slows down to lead you through it. Then there's this thing called sensationism, which really shakes up the old way of thinking about art. Back in the day, art aimed to be authentic and heartfelt. But sensationism, it's a whole new game. It's about ditching the artist's personal touch altogether, The creator disappears behind the art, serving as a channel for raw sensation. This is where Pessoa, a big name in this movement, steps in with his heteronyms, imaginary personas he uses to cast his spell. By doing this, he completely cuts off any ties to his own emotions. The art stands on its own, without needing to dig into the artist's life to find meaning. This reflects some broader shifts happening in modernist art. Around that time, T.S. Eliot was singing a similar tune with his idea of impersonality. He believed poetry should be an escape from emotion, not a release of it. Ezra Pound chimed in with imagism, focusing on stripping away the unnecessary to hit the core. And futurism? They were all about the sensory buzz of rapid machines and a fast-moving world. But Pessoa's angle is a bit different. While Eliot thought poets should stick with a single tradition, Pessoa was all about mixing things up and tossing different traditions together. In contrast to Pound, who sought the perfect word, Pessoa's sensationism says there are countless perspectives, different feelings to explore. And while futurism zooms in on one experience, the industrial, Pessoa celebrates the richness of sensation, with each sense offering its own reality. This shifts our view of art dramatically. If it's all about crafting sensations, then old standards for judging art simply fall apart. It's not about sincerity or realism anymore. It's more about whether art delivers powerful and varied sensations. This paves the way for wild creativity, but leaves us without a clear benchmark for quality. Pessoa also had thoughts about blending art forms. The traditional view held that painting, poetry, and music should stay in their lanes. But sensationism considers them all methods of creating sensations, leading to a fusion, like poetry that sounds like music or tries painting with words. That's what his heteronyms do, offer different perspectives on the world. Sensationism isn't without its challenges, though. If any sensation-inducing art is valid, how do you separate the great from the average? Pessoa never spelled that out. He might just say that good and bad don't fly anymore. But then, how do we critique art? It leaves us noting sensations without evaluating them. Communication's another tricky part. If art is all about the sensations it creates, how do we compare the impact of one piece over another? These questions suggest that sensationism isn't neatly defined. But that's what makes it so intriguing, right? So here's the thing. If art is purely about creating sensations without conveying intentional messages, how do artists and viewers actually connect? Traditional theories saw art as a means of conveying meaning or emotions from artist to audience. But sensationism tells a different story. If there's no message being delivered, what's the point of art? Pessoa might argue that sharing the sensation itself is the goal. However, here's the kicker. Everyone experiences these sensations differently. How you feel about a piece of art isn't going to match the next person's reaction. All right, let's break this down. What are we really diving into here? Let's talk about meaning first. If you're rolling with sensationism and ignoring deeper meanings in art as just sensory stimulation, then how do you look at Pessoa's works? His poetry isn't just random words, it's full of meaning. He created these different characters, or heteronyms, who dive into profound philosophical musings, worldviews, and share unique thoughts. So, where does that fit into the idea of pure sensation? Pessoa could argue that these meanings themselves are sensations, ideas felt mentally. But if you start labeling everything as just sensation, then the word begins to lose its punch and doesn't really explain much anymore. Now, let's chat about originality. Sensationism is pitched as this avant-garde idea, right? But is it truly a fresh concept? Way back in the late 19th century, Oscar Wilde and folks like Walter Pater were already leaning more toward sensation over meaning. Wilde famously said, "All art is quite useless," meaning art didn't need to justify itself beyond being pleasurable. So, what makes sensationism different from those ideas? Pessoa might say it's deeply grounded in empirical philosophy, expanded creatively through his heteronyms, and more methodically put together. But some critics might shrug it off as just a continuation, not a big game changer. There's also the question of whether Pessoa's poetry meets sensationist ideals. Take Cairo, one of his personas. His poems claim to be pure sensory experiences without the clutter of thought. But they're written in words, and words mean concepts. You can't honestly get away from words while using words. Just the act of describing a sensation involves some level of interpretation. So, claiming pure perception becomes another idea about perception, which is kind of a paradox. Same with Reyes, another persona. His poems pull in classical references, but references are thoughts, not just raw sensations. Campos throws readers into chaos and imagery, yet he still depends on language to make any sense of it. Poetry is inherently conceptual, so trying to achieve sensationism's ideals perfectly in real life is an uphill battle. On the science side of things, do we ever really experience pure sensation? Cognitive science today begs to differ. Our perception and interpretation are intertwined. The brain doesn't first get raw data to then analyze. It all blends together, with understanding mixed right in with sensing. You can't pull apart sensation and the mind's way of categorizing. Pessoa's viewpoint kind of clashes with what modern psychology tells us. Pure sensation? Not quite a thing. Despite these bumps, sensationism brought some intriguing ideas to art theory. It brought the focus back on sensory enjoyment in art, which had often been overshadowed by meaning and emotions. It opened up the idea that artworks craft their own realities, laying groundwork for constructivist aesthetics. It encouraged embracing diversity over sticking to one style, allowing more space for fragmented, even contradictory art. It showcased how a single artist could experiment with various techniques by playing with different sensory perspectives. Even if the overarching theory isn't rock solid, these smaller insights hold their worth. In practical terms, sensationism influenced how Pessoa crafted his poetry. Despite the theoretical hiccups, sensationism helped Pessoa's personas create standout works. Cairo's poems, for instance, capture readers with their clarity and freshness just by trimming away unnecessary conceptual stuff. Reyes's classic precision invites us to think deeply about time and the certainty of our own mortality. On the other side, Campos is bursting with energy that vividly illustrates the pressures and mental struggles of today's world. Even though the aesthetic theory made waves in the art world, it stumbled when it came to philosophy. This illustrates that while philosophically confusing ideas might seem jumbled, they can still spark incredible artistic creations. So, the debate rages on. Does sensationism shed light on the broader world of art, or is it really just the secret sauce for Pessoa's own work? Is it about unveiling big truths that apply everywhere, or is it focused on one particular experience? Pessoa believed he had tapped into profound insights about what makes art tick. However, a lot of specialists think he was detailing his personal recipe for creativity and mistook it for a universal rulebook. The diverse personalities in his work clicked with him because of his peculiar mindset, not because they represented necessary ingredients for creating art. Other artists thrive using completely different methods. For confessional poets, being open and sincere is powerful. For traditional artists, harmony is key. And for romantics, full expression naturally suits them. Sensationism is just one of many roads. Fantastic for some, but definitely not the best route for everyone. The crux of the matter might be that sensationism, like all of Pessoa's philosophical musings, stretches good ideas so far that they kind of fall apart. Yes, sensation is important in art. However, so is significance, emotion, form, tradition, and innovation. Sure, taking a step back from personal influence can fuel creativity, but so can embracing your true self. Exploring numerous options is enriching, but so is remaining steadfast in a singular vision. While sensationism shines a light on important truths about how we relate to art, it pushes these insights beyond their limits into a theory that doesn't quite cover art's wide-ranging array. Its real worth lives in those nuggets of wisdom, not the whole big idea. Part 5. Political Philosophy and the Fifth Empire. Pessoa's political views are a real mishmash. He mixes together ideas that don't typically go hand in hand, like reactionary nationalism alongside individualistic anarchism, and then throws in some wild prophetic dreams mixed with hard-nosed realism, plus combines mystical beliefs with practical policy ideas. At the core of all this is the idea of the Fifth Empire, a mystical vision where Portugal rises to lead the world, culturally and spiritually. To really get what he's on about, we have to look back at Portugal's political scene in the early 1900s and the mystical angles Pessoa drew from. When Pessoa was around, Portugal was all over the place politically. The monarchy was kicked out in 1910, giving way to a republic that lurched from one group to another. This era, known as the First Republic, was chaotic, riddled with political turmoil, assassinations, and coups. Pessoa looked at all this and felt nothing but contempt. He wasn't a fan of republican democracy, feeling it handed power to people who had no clue. And socialism and communism were off the table for him too, thinking they threatened personal liberty. For a bit, he even cheered for the military regime of Sidonio Pius, scribbling down a poem that cast Pius as a kind of larger-than-life hero. But after Pius was assassinated in 1918, Pessoa became increasingly disheartened about Portugal's political future. The concept of the Fifth Empire came to life as a remedy to the chaos he witnessed, informed by the prophecies of 16th-century Portuguese mystic Gonçalo Anes Bandara and 17th-century Jesuit thinker Antonio Vieira. Pessoa envisioned Portugal leading the world into a fresh cultural and spiritual age. But this wasn't about flexing military or economic muscle. Portugal had lost those long ago. Instead, it was through their language, cultural reach, and spiritual insights. To Pessoa, the Portuguese language would emerge as the language of the future, spreading Portuguese spiritual ideals worldwide. This vision was steeped in a Portuguese belief system called Sebastianism. It began when King Sebastian disappeared in a battle back in 1578, sparking legends that he'd returned to reclaim Portugal's past glories. This belief was no mere elite indulgence. It persisted through the ages, particularly among everyday people. Vieira took this further, proposing the Fifth Empire, as foretold in the Bible's book of Daniel, would be Portuguese, following the Assyrian, Persian, Greek, and Roman empires. Pessoa took this notion and reinvented it, transforming the Fifth Empire from a territorial dream into a spiritual and cultural one. In Pessoa's worldview, history had progressed through 5 empires, with each contributing a crucial element. The Greeks gave us knowledge and philosophy, Rome spread that culture and added a layer of law, Christianity blended Western and Eastern wisdom, and then Europe, led by the British Empire, pushed this mix worldwide through individuality and commerce. The Fifth Empire was seen as the grand finale, merging material and spiritual insights, combining logic with mysticism, and uniting wisdom from the West and the East. Portugal, with its deep roots in ancient spiritual ways and open arms for modern ideas, was in line to lead this new era. His one book published in his lifetime, Message, spells out this grand vision through 44 short poems celebrating Portugal's history and predicting its future. It's divided into 3 parts, tracing Portugal's journey from mythical origins through a period of historical greatness to its ultimate destiny. The last section, the hidden one, specifically calls out the Fifth Empire, casting King Sebastian as a messiah-like figure who'd usher in this new age. The hidden one also delves into esoteric traditions, suggesting secret knowledge kept by a few, which would be revealed when the time was right. So, Fernando Pessoa didn't just dabble in mysticism and esoteric stuff, he was fully immersed. He was deeply into astrology, making star charts to predict the future of Portugal. He also explored Rosicrucianism, Theosophy, Freemasonry, and other secretive schools of thought, believing they held the secret knowledge needed to bring about what he envisioned as the Fifth Empire. He dedicated considerable time to formulating intricate theories on how Portugal's cultural mindset ought to prepare for what lay ahead. To him, his writings, particularly those under various pseudonyms, were a step toward realizing the Fifth Empire, embodying a vision that reflected Portugal's intellectual and cultural prowess. But here's where things get a bit twisted. His brand of nationalism sometimes tipped over into prejudiced views. He wasn't shy about expressing his disparaging opinions about Africans, Asians, and even other European people. He seemed to think Portuguese culture was unmatched and destined for some kind of spiritual leadership, whether through divine favor or historical evolution. He showed a preference for authoritarian systems, regarding democracy as too mundane and inefficient. He thought dictatorships could potentially empower the exceptional. Fascist ideals, especially economic structure and abandoning parliamentary systems, caught his eye. He didn't think much of universal suffrage, arguing that not everyone was fit for decision-making. This has led to a lot of scholarly debate about how seriously to take his political thoughts. Some folks think his leaning toward authoritarian ideas is dangerous stuff. Others, his focus on the individual didn't align well with totalitarianism, and his mystical pursuits seemed more personal than politically driven. Ultimately, Pessoa's political ideas were kind of a mixed bag with no real coherence. On one hand, he was all for radical individualism, advocating for limited government, maximum liberty, and identifying only with self-chosen ties. His views echoed anarchism, suggesting minimal state involvement was the way to go. He wasn't a fan of collective thinking, mass movements, or individuals getting lost in the crowd. He idolized the independent thinker, seeking truth regardless of societal norms. In this sense, his thoughts had a libertarian flavor, challenging all forms of collectivism. On the flip side, he also favored authoritarian nationalism. He believed in letting the elite lead the way for those deemed less knowledgeable. He cherished hierarchy, tradition, and order, resisting democracy's leveling effect. He was convinced of Portugal's cultural supremacy and its historical destiny. He thought those with foresight should steer the ship, not the unpredictable majority. His vision for Portugal involved cultural and spiritual dominance, marked by reactionary and elitist undertones that skirted close to fascism. But these ideas never quite fit together seamlessly. It's a bit like he yearned for a world where exceptional individuals like himself could thrive under anarchism, while advocating for authoritarian control over everyone else. He envisioned freedom for the intellectual elite and structure for ordinary folks. He sought for Portugal to shine culturally, with individuals free to explore on their own terms. Politically, it was a messy mix, but it reflects his psychology well. He had a sense of superiority, craved recognition for his brilliance, yet longed for solitude and resisted social connections. All right, let's dig into this idea of the Fifth Empire. First off, there are some big hurdles here. If we look at the facts, Portugal wasn't exactly set up to lead some massive spiritual revolution around the globe. When Pessoa was around, the country was struggling. There was political chaos, the economy was in a slump, and its colonial power was fading fast. There wasn't a hint of a cultural coup coming. That's why Pessoa envisioned this empire as more of a spiritual thing rather than a territorial one. But here's the rub. Proving spiritual dominance is a whole other beast. How do you even begin to measure if Portugal hit the jackpot in that department? Pessoa didn't lay out any solid rules or benchmarks, just a lot of mystical thoughts. Then we've got the history angle. The way he interpreted the patterns of past empires is still a hot topic for debate. Let's break it down a bit. The whole notion that Greece was the ultimate source of wisdom, that Rome was just transporting Greek ideas far and wide, and Christianity magically blended everything together, is a bit shaky. And the idea that Europe simply carried on from where Christianity left off? Well, that's debatable too. Plus, claiming that British individualism is Europe's major gift to the world? Most historians would have a lot to argue about there. Pessoa's historical take seems infused with mythology, more than grounded in hard facts, as he's looking at the past with somewhat romanticized ideas, trying to set up a vision for the future as he sees it. Now, on to the language bit. Pessoa was pretty sure Portuguese was destined for global greatness. But let's be realistic. When stacked up against English, Spanish, Chinese, or Arabic, Portuguese doesn't exactly have the same global sway. And Brazil, where more folks speak Portuguese than in Portugal itself, was charting its own cultural course. Unless you believe Portuguese has some magical qualities other languages don't, it's a tough sell. Linguists would probably call this a big reach. Now, let's address the sticky topic of colonialism. During Pessoa's life, Portugal still held on to its colonies in Africa and Asia. His Fifth Empire idea hinges a lot on Portugal's colonial past, hinting it could push cultural influence in regions it no longer owned. But we can't ignore that colonialism involved a ton of exploitation, slavery, and violence. The idea that Portugal should lead some kind of spiritual empire reeks of old-school European superiority beliefs. Naturally, folks who critique colonialism aren't thrilled about this, calling it imperialistic thinking disguised with fancy language. And then there's the touchy subject of fascism. Pessoa's ties to fascism are kind of a gray area. The Fifth Empire idea does have a whiff of fascism with its emphasis on national glory, a supposed historical mission, strong leadership, and the notion of cultural superiority. Pessoa might argue his nationalism was about cultural identity, not racial, and more spiritual than material. But really, it's all about the broader view of his mindset. So, are we talking a serious political vision here, or just some elaborate literary dream? That's still a big question. Some stuff he wrote makes it seem like he honestly thought Portugal would climb to spiritual leadership. Yet in other writings, you get the sense he understood the gap between myth and reality. Maybe he was playing in both worlds, seeing the Fifth Empire as both a future projection and a creative canvas. Either way, his political ideas didn't exactly take off. He didn't spark movements, draft any policies that were adopted, or leave much of a political footprint outside of his literary work. Grasping Pessoa's political stance can shed light on his thought process and poetry, even if it didn't turn the world upside down. They do show how a philosophical genius could misstep politically, morphing clever language into ideological confusion and letting personal seclusion stir up grand dreams. The key question is whether we can untangle his deep philosophical insights into identity and consciousness from his tricky political beliefs. Many folks say we can, arguing that his deep dive into metaphysical and artistic ideas can stand on their own merit. Yet others believe there's a stronger link, suggesting that the traits fueling his self-reflective ideas also emerge in his nationalistic musings. This discussion seems far from over. But what's evident is that when it came to applying his philosophical ideas to politics, Pessoa didn't quite bridge the gap. His take on individual identity and the nature of the self doesn't seem to work on a larger political canvas. Nations aren't like individual people. For a society to share a common identity, it needs a steady narrative. But Pessoa's thinking tends to unravel that. Politics requires commitment, which his skepticism unsettles, and society requires steadiness, which his multi-perspective view undermines. Whenever he tried to tackle politics, it either descended into puzzling contradictions or ventured into risky mystic territory. Seeing life in bits and pieces made it hard for him to picture a cohesive existence for communities. This might point to where philosophy hits a wall. Some problems demand solutions bigger than a lone viewpoint. Political philosophy must lay out how massive groups of people join forces, find common interests, and set up systems. But Pessoa's sharp focus on individualism and his doubts about a united identity make that difficult. While his philosophy works wonders for understanding a single mind, it doesn't quite nail how humans coexist in societies. His take on political thinking highlights where his ideas don't quite pan out practically. Part 6. Diving into the mystical world with Pessoa. Pessoa was super into the mysterious and mystical side of life, a fact that often gets brushed past in discussions about his work. People love to chat about his sharp writing and profound ideas, but they often ignore his fascination with astrology, Rosicrucian beliefs, Hermeticism, Kabbalah, Theosophy, and other Western mystical traditions. For him, these weren't just side interests. They were at the core of his philosophy. When he talked about spiritual influences and secret wisdom only for the chosen few, he truly meant it. No sarcasm or metaphor there. To really understand Pessoa, you have to get how much he loved symbolic thinking. From early on, he said his mind naturally leaned toward symbols and analogies. Now, someone into scientific thinking might dismiss symbols as outdated, but Pessoa saw them differently. He believed that symbolic thinking beat out logical reasoning because symbols reveal connections that plain logic just misses. Symbols point out links and similarities that the rational brain, with its focus on pure facts and logic, often can't perceive. This ties right into a key idea from Hermetic philosophy. As above, so below. It's all about how the universe is interconnected. Events up in the heavens influence what's happening here on Earth. For Pessoa, to truly understand life, you needed to spot these connections and recognize the hidden patterns tying everything together. While rational thinking likes to categorize stuff neatly, symbolic thinking shows how, deep down, it's all connected. Astrology for Pessoa was no joke. He wasn't just skimming horoscopes for fun, he put serious effort into it. He'd crunch the numbers to find planetary positions accurately and create detailed astrological charts. He made them for himself. For his alter egos, he called heteronyms, for famous people, and even for Portugal itself. He'd even predict political happenings, personal fortunes, and cultural changes based on the stars. To him, astrology explained human behavior far better than history or sociology. It was a legit belief system, not superstition. Pessoa believed that if the mind was a bunch of different parts, astrology was what tied it all together. Your birth chart lays out the cosmic setup at the time you were born, shaping your personality and setting the scene for your life. While it doesn't take away your free will, it does set the framework for how you can express it. Each of his different personas got their own birth chart because each needed an astrological map to account for their unique traits. Pessoa was also really into Rosicrucianism, a mystical Christian belief that claims to have ancient secret knowledge. Rosicrucians are into spiritual growth, a mystical spin on Christianity, and expecting a shift to higher consciousness. They use alchemical symbols, detailed geometry, and epic mythology. Pessoa soaked all of this in, weaving it into his vision of a fifth empire. For him, the Fifth Empire wasn't about politics. It was about a Rosicrucian prophecy forecasting a spiritual shift predicted by esoteric teachings. He got massively interested in sacred geometry, believing circles, triangles, and squares had hidden meanings. To him, these shapes weren't just math problems. They were symbols of divine order. He saw the universe as created with geometric precision and thought that understanding these shapes could open the door to the universe's secrets. Pessoa's poetry is full of geometric images, not just for looks, but to dig into ideas that words alone have a hard time getting across. He explored Kabbalah too, a deep well of Jewish mysticism focused on divine layouts and secret messages hidden in holy texts. Things like the tree of life and the idea of many layers of reality influenced his thinking about self and identity. His heteronyms might even be seen as different bits of divine thoughts living out in human form. Now, there's some talk about whether he really dove into Freemasonry or just dabbled, but you do spot its themes in his work. The vibe of hidden knowledge, slow reveals, and symbolic ceremonies fit right in with how he viewed life. He was also into theosophy, which is like Helena Blavatsky's mix of spiritual ideas from the East and West. Stuff like karma, reincarnation, and growing spiritually threads through his creations. But did he really believe all this mystical stuff? Academics aren't sure if he was totally into it or just exploring intellectually. It seems like a bit of both. He spent serious time on the occult and wrote about it earnestly, yet also enjoyed an ironic detachment, seeing mystical stories as myth as much as fact. This connects to his bigger worldview. When logic alone can't crack all of life's puzzles, maybe other ways of knowing step up. Mysticism might peek behind the curtain where logic stops. Symbols can hit truths that regular words miss, and secret traditions hold on to wisdom that reason leaves behind. Pessoa's alter egos act like windows, each letting in a different light on life. Creating and embodying these personas became kind of a spiritual journey, not just a writing stunt, but it also stirs up some deep questions. First, there's figuring out if mystical insights are genuine. How do you spot what's real and what's just in your head? Without clear-cut logic, aren't we just believing anything? Pessoa might say the real test is living it out, finding meaning in symbols that illuminate life. But it's a personal proof, not a one-size-fits-all measure. Then there's the picking and choosing. He drew from different mystical schools like Rosicrucianism, Kabbalah, Hermeticism, and Theosophy, each pushing their own truths. How'd he decide what to believe? Looked like he embraced a mashup, taking what resonated and sidestepping contradictions, though it blurred his mystical viewpoint. Believing in overlapping Jewish, Christian, and Hindu views all at once only hangs together if you read them as metaphors. But metaphors for what, exactly? That's something Pessoa left as an open question. Lastly, there's whether any of this magic actually works. His astrology predictions missed the target, and his magic didn't visibly shake things up. Predictions about Portugal's future glory didn't pan out either. Looking at it practically, his mysticism didn't cut it in the real world. His comeback might be that the true shift is internal, a change in mindset, rather than in the world around us. But this hints that occult practices might be more about self-delusion or placebo effects. Okay, let's give this another shot. First off, there's that political angle we spoke about earlier. Delving into esoteric elitism can slide into political elitism really fast. If a tiny group holds secret knowledge and the rest don't, then it's easy to think those with the secret should rule over everyone else. This sets up hierarchies, leads to authoritarian vibes, and clashes with fair, democratic ideals. It's like Pessoa's blend of mysticism and politics just feed off each other in a complicated way. It suggests that those who are spiritually enlightened should lead the uninformed masses. So, there's this long-running discussion among scholars about whether Pessoa's dive into mysticism was a sincere spiritual journey or just an escape from the letdowns of life. When you look at his life story, he spent a lot of time by himself and didn't hit it big in terms of recognition or personal joy. Mystical ideas might have given him a purpose that real life just couldn't offer. The notion of having secret insights and a unique mission might have been his way of making up for not achieving his worldly goals. Now, this might clarify the psychological angle, but it doesn't really validate his mystical beliefs. Lots of folks get drawn into mystical stuff when real life feels lacking, yet it doesn't automatically make these beliefs true. Maybe they just fit certain personalities well. Another interesting point is how we interpret symbols. Symbols, by nature, are open to a lot of different meanings. Think about things like geometric patterns, zodiac symbols, or stories from myths. They can mean drastically different things to different people. They don't have fixed meanings or an objective truth. So, while symbols might not be great for gaining concrete knowledge, they definitely hold a place in art and personal discovery. Even with all these questions lingering, Pessoa's mysticism significantly shaped his work both in his philosophical thoughts and his artistic creations. His reliance on symbolic thinking gave rise to his various alter egos, each embodying its own symbolic expression, a way of experiencing the world through the lens of myths and timeless narratives. Moving away from strict rationality and literal thinking allowed him to explore fresh and wild ideas. His belief in hidden connections and multiple realities deeply influenced his take on identity and consciousness. In his writings, mysticism and philosophy danced together, casting off rigid scientific and straightforward rational views. Today's big challenge is deciding if there's anything truly valuable to draw from Pessoa's mystical tendencies. Some scholars view it as an intriguing lens into his mind, but not crucial for evaluating his ideas. On the flip side, others contest that ignoring his mysticism means losing the core of his thinking. Perhaps his mystical ideas spun out compelling metaphors and structures that hold up artistically, even if they don't hit the mark in a literal sense. The true worth is in the art and thoughts that blossomed from these mystical inspirations, not the factual accuracy of the starting point. This frames a practical approach. Maybe assessing mysticism should be about what it contributes, instead of checking if it's literally true. If symbolic stories spark cool new ideas, why not embrace them, true or not? Like, if astrology can shed light on personality traits, why not accept its insight even if planets aren't actually influencing things? And if old esoteric stories bring meaning into life, adopt them whether they're factually correct or not. Pessoa seemed to follow this path, using mystical ideas to fuel his philosophical and artistic pursuits. However, this approach has its downsides. It basically turns mysticism into a useful fiction rather than a path to true knowledge, which might not sit well with dedicated mystics. Toning down the truth components reduces mysticism to just personal taste or artistic flair. Some beliefs might demand a deeper faith instead of just being practical tools. True mysticism might require a belief that goes deeper than just an aesthetic or functionality. If that's the truth, then Pessoa's approach, a sort of clever yet detached stance, might be something that's hard to commit to completely. Craving spiritual insight without believing in spirituality, and wanting secret wisdom without accepting any as the absolute truth, that's a bit of a puzzler. It's like being a mystic who questions their own mysticism, or a philosopher who's unsure about philosophy itself. In Part 7, we dive into modernism and how it sparked new ways of writing. Fernando Pessoa was a big deal in this scene, but he wasn't your typical modernist. He was right there when Portuguese modernism kicked off, and even helped start the journal Orfeo in 1915 that really shook things up in Lisbon. Unlike a lot of other modernists, though, he wasn't into mixing with the international crowd. He hardly traveled, didn't publish a ton, and stayed pretty independent from other writers of his time. His style was more like a solo act, connecting with the changes in Europe and America through coincidence rather than direct influence. The buzz around Orfeo deserves a mention because it's a prime example of how Pessoa liked to push the envelope. The journal only put out 2 issues, but they were packed with daring poetry and controversial manifestos that aimed to shake up the middle-class mindset. Critics slammed it, calling its contributors crazy and degenerate. But that's the reaction Pessoa was aiming for. He believed modernism was all about tossing out not just the old art forms, but also the cultural norms propping them up. To him, riling up the bourgeoisie wasn't just a prank, it was about showing that their tastes were more about avoiding risk than appreciating real art. Still, what Pessoa was up to wasn't quite like other branches of modernism. Look at Italian Futurism, for example, which influenced his alter ego, Alvaro de Campos. Futurism was all about speed, power, machines, and war. Very macho, not very forward-thinking politically, and kind of basic artistically. Pessoa picked up on the energy but skipped the ideology. Campos might write these machine-loving poems but often ends up stuck, showing how technology's so-called freedom could lead to mental chaos. The buzz around futurism gets exposed as a frantic show hiding a big existential nothingness. At the same time, French surrealism in the 1920s started poking around in the subconscious with automatic writing and dream worlds. Pessoa played with the idea of automatic writing and explored the split nature of the psyche. But while surrealists were hunting for some deeper truth beneath societal norms, Pessoa saw more of a mess. No unified self, just a bunch of conflicting pieces. Where surrealists saw freedom in the unconscious, Pessoa saw layers of fiction, just like the conscious mind. He believed there was no true essence to discover, just different layers of make-believe. English and American modernists like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound were into things like impersonality and messing with tradition. In Eliot's The Waste Land, you get this mix of styles and snippets from different languages and cultures all stitched together to make a picture of cultural chaos. Pessoa took things further. While Eliot balanced different perspectives with one authorial voice, Pessoa created entirely separate authors. Eliot might bring tradition into his work. Pessoa embodied it through his various personas, each with its historical style. Joyce's narrative acrobatics in Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake played with similar themes. Both Pessoa and Joyce tore apart the idea of a single narrative voice with multiple, sometimes clashing, personalities. Both saw identity as something crafted by language and how we express ourselves. They both pushed the boundaries of modernism so far that it sometimes made their work tough to read. Still, Joyce kept a personal thread running through his work, an Irish writer capturing multiple voices. Pessoa pushed past that idea, living out a fractured biography with genuinely separate identities. Virginia Woolf's look at consciousness especially in The Waves, with its 6 unique voices, mirrored Pessoa's vibe. But Woolf's characters were just that, characters created by a writer. Pessoa's heteronyms might appear as mere fictional characters, but according to him, they're far more. They're different selves he inhabited, not just ones he dreamed up. This isn't just a literary gimmick, it taps into philosophical territory. If they were just characters, it would be a testament to his exceptional storytelling. But if they're actual alternative identities, then Pessoa did something that changed the game philosophically. Looking at it from a technical angle, Pessoa introduced some fascinating innovations to poetry that people still haven't fully recognized. Intersectionism, for instance, is a term scholars use to describe how he tried to capture multiple perspectives at once in a single poem. While most poems present one point of view at a time, intersectionist poetry mimics our real experience of the world, layered and complex. This idea only caught on much later, although Pessoa was exploring it back in the 1910s. His poetic voices were revolutionary, demonstrating a unique sophistication unseen before. Each heteronym had its own distinctive style. Cairo, for instance, stuck to present tense and avoided subordinate clauses, focusing on direct perception. Conversely, Race favored lengthy, complex sentences in classical meters, matching his stoic and formal demeanor. Campo's style was all over the place. His syntax shifted wildly with his mood, from fast and chaotic to slow and dense. Pessoa himself? His writing was deeply introspective, full of self-doubt, and often steeped in philosophical musings in Portuguese. But it wasn't just about style. Pessoa dabbled in what you might call philosophical lyricism, blending the intellectual depth typically reserved for prose with the emotional intensity of poetry. Most poems either express emotion or tackle ideas, but Pessoa managed to do both simultaneously. He used vivid imagery and metaphors to land philosophical arguments with emotional impact, like when he compared the splendor of the Tagus River to the modest river of his hometown, making a philosophical argument about the immeasurability of things, while also paying homage to a specific location. Pessoa's influence stretched beyond poetry. His work, especially the Book of Disquiet, broke new ground for others to explore. This fictional diary, with its philosophical reflections, influenced writers like Clarice Lispector and W.G. Sebald, examining themes such as the blurred line between autobiography and fiction, the absence of conventional narrative, and the mix of mundane observations with profound existential thoughts. Moreover, he transformed the notion of authorship. Before him, pseudonyms served as a shield for privacy or as a way for women to publish without using their real names, with the true author generally known. But Pessoa's heteronyms were a different breed. They had their own histories, personalities, and views that could even contradict Pessoa's own. They interacted, debated, and took varied stands in the literary arena, making the concept of authorship itself a complex puzzle. This challenges the way we perceive literature. Typically, we assume one author means one voice, one perspective, tied to one historical context. But with Pessoa, that's not the case. He pushed us to question those assumptions. When you delve into Cairo's writing, do you interpret it through what we know of Cairo's fictional life and beliefs, by Pessoa's own circumstances, or by how they connect with each other? There's no single right answer, since the text balances on a fine line between reality and fiction, between character and creator. between the dreamt and the revealed. Thinkers like Roland Barthes touched on this, arguing that the author's influence ends once the text is written, and it's up to readers to interpret it in their way. Pessoa also navigated complex ideas, but he came at them differently. While Barthes aimed to liberate the text by getting rid of the author entirely, Pessoa just kind of crowded the space with more authors, showing us from the start there's never just one author to handle. They both ended up reaching the same spot, but they took very different paths to get there. Pessoa's journey was more adventurous because he didn't just theorize about it. He actually lived it. However, this uncovered some sticking points within modernism itself. If you dig too deep into his approach, how do you even go about publishing something? If you're truly a bunch of different people, which version of you decides what gets published? Who's signing on the dotted line or taking heat or praise for it? Pessoa barely got any work out there because you couldn't really publish anything as a fragmented self. He had a huge concept that should have blossomed into a bunch of works, but instead mostly resulted in silence and fragments. When it comes to how Pessoa tied together story and thought, it can make things a bit challenging to decipher. Folks often find the Book of Disquiet hard to grasp. It doesn't give you a quick read with a clear plot, clear character development, or nicely laid out themes. Readers need to really pay attention and stay committed, which can put many people off. While his art was groundbreaking, it struggled to connect with an audience. He was all about the inner world, and if you stray too far down that road, you can end up with nothing to write about. If the world out there doesn't matter, if pondering is more important than doing, if dreams are better than reality, then what's left to put into words? You're left turning your own thoughts inside out. That's great for deep thinking, but not for a wide range of subjects. You won't stumble across love poems from Pessoa because he didn't go through love, nor political ones since he skirted around politics. And traditional nature poems don't show up because nature was merely a backdrop for his thinking. His fresh take on literature pared down the usual themes. Some scholars debate whether Pessoa took modernism to its height or if he essentially dug its grave. Fans think of him as someone who took modernist ideas to their logical extremes, revealing truths others only suggested. Critics reckon he highlighted modernism's flaws, such as its focus on self, darkness, and detachment. Both views seem valid. Pessoa showed what unchecked modernist creativity could lead to, resulting in something both amazing and sort of a dead end. Today's authors have to grapple with what to do with Pessoa's ideas. You can't just mimic his use of different personas because their strength lay in their uniqueness. You can't fully adopt his method because it leads to isolation and unfinished work. But perhaps you can take cues from his concepts without diving in head first. Embrace the idea that identity isn't one-dimensional without entirely fragmenting yourself. Delve into introspection while keeping a connection to the outside world. Experiment with structure without making your work too hard to follow. This balanced approach might retain Pessoa's insights while avoiding his pitfalls, though it might also lack what made his work so special in the first place: the fearless quest for truth, even when it led to silence and disintegration. Part 8. Influence, Legacy, and Modern Importance. It's kind of funny how Pessoa ended up being such a huge influence. Back when he was alive, he didn't exactly chase after fame. He hardly published anything, lived a pretty low-key life, and when he died, not many noticed, apart from a few folks in Lisbon. Yet today, He's seen as this big shot, a serious heavyweight among 20th century writers. Philosophical movements like existentialism, postmodernism, and ideas about plural identity all want to rope him in as one of their key figures. To get why his star rose so much later, we need to dig into how his work grabbed the world's attention long after his time and why it resonates with modern times. His big moment came thanks to a trunk. After he died in 1935, a buddy of his stumbled across a massive wooden chest holding over 25,000 pages of Pessoa's writings. Poems, bits of stories, plays, deep essays, translations, all sorts of things. It was a massive job sifting through, sorting, and publishing this mountain of work. The first major poetry collection didn't appear until 1942, and the complete Portuguese Book of Disquiet wasn't available until 1982. More important pieces kept coming out all the way into the 1990s and 2000s. So, in a way, Pessoa's true literary journey began after his death. This late blooming is pretty important. Unlike authors who can shape their legacy before they pass by deciding what gets published, Pessoa left behind a jumbled mess. Editors had to make the tough calls about what to release, how to stitch together fragments, which poem versions to use, and determine who wrote what, under which heteronym. Each editor's choices meant that many different versions of Pessoa's work popped up. There isn't one definitive Pessoa, just a bunch of interpretations pieced together from his original writings. This chaos makes him one of modernism's most truly unpredictable writers, with no singular concrete text. His rise to international stardom wasn't immediate. The first English translation appeared in 1938, a few years posthumously. It wasn't really until the 1960s and 70s that English translations gained momentum, and the complete Book of Disquiet in English came out in 2002. Translations in French, German, Spanish, and Italian followed a similar timeline. It took time, but eventually people caught on. In Portugal, they recognized his genius earlier, but he mostly remained a local legend until late in the 20th century. Pessoa's big break came when shifts in literary theory and philosophy cast his work as forward-thinking. Post-structuralist thinkers challenged the idea of a singular stable self, proposing that language plays a key role in forming identity rather than merely reflecting it, and praised the richness texts can possess. Pessoa's work fits snugly into this fresh framework. Scholars used his heteronyms to drive home these philosophical concepts. Barth's idea of the death of the author? That's all over Pessoa's work, with his many personas. Derrida's concept of infinite meanings is mirrored in Pessoa's use of heteronyms. Foucault's idea of author function comes alive in the way Pessoa managed to be multiple authors at once. Existentialists grabbed onto Pessoa too, though after he was gone. He explored ideas around being true to oneself and the struggle with self-deception, suggesting identity is about choices, and that our consciousness is what brings meaning to a universe that seems devoid of it. The existential idea that existence precedes essence could have been Pessoa's catchphrase, and Camus' brand of absurdity runs through the Book of Disquiet. Even though Pessoa died before existentialism was a full-fledged movement, his work clearly hinted at its major themes ahead of the curve. These days, Pessoa's thoughts on identity seem to hit home. Even though he's been gone for a while, his take on identity as something you act out that's diverse and made up, finds fans among queer theorists, transgender rights folks, and researchers working on different identity topics. His heteronyms, a set of fictional characters he created each with distinct identities, show that one person can slip into different roles without losing authenticity. They prove you can be several things at once without drifting away from your true self. There's a bit of politics lurking in these ideas, though Pessoa didn't exactly set out with that in mind, but his writings kick open a lot of doors. Over in psychology and cognitive science, people are intrigued by what he was up to. Thoughts about the mind working in sections or having varied states get along well with his heteronyms. It's almost like he offered a look into how our minds function when free from sticking to just one role. Some psychologists reckon that having multiple identities isn't a disorder, but more like a trait people naturally have, with Pessoa being a solid example of this blend. Others feel there might have been some struggle there, but it sure produced some incredible work. The debate is far from over. In the realm of literature, Pessoa continues to be a big influence. Octavio Paz said he was among the century's best poets, and Harold Bloom considered him crucial to Western literature. Modern poets from all over look up to him, especially those experimenting with different voices, digging into identity, or weaving deep thoughts into their verses. On the prose side, his Book of Disquiet has left a mark on writers like W.G. Sebald, Enrique Villa-Matas, and Clarice Lispector. His style of broken, thoughtful writing has carved out its own niche. When it comes to philosophy, Pessoa's thoughts have sparked lots of chats about who we are, our awareness, and consciousness itself. Philosophers interested in how stories shape us often cite his work to highlight how narrative forms our identity. For those investigating consciousness from different angles, his stuff is a treasure trove. Academics interested in how far we can stray from a single consciousness before hitting a wall find his work particularly fascinating. Essentially, Pessoa's become a favorite for philosophical exploration, far beyond just his literary fame. Over in Portugal, Pessoa is nearly revered. They used to put him on their money before switching to the euro, built statues, and opened the Casa Fernando Pessoa Museum in his memory. Scholars keep digging through his work, publishing new editions, and poring over every last bit. Ask any informed Portuguese person, and they'll likely be able to recite his work on cue. He stands as a global icon for Portuguese culture, right alongside cherished national symbols. It's kind of amusing given he had some sharp critiques for Portuguese society and politics in his time. The nation he critiqued now celebrates him as one of its biggest cultural exports. But this fame can lead to confusion. Many people try to claim Pessoa lines up with ideas he probably wouldn't agree with. Those into his identity experiments might skip over his more conservative beliefs. Similarly, fans of postmodern thought might celebrate his text's ambiguity while ignoring his mystical side, while others dwell on his psychological state, overlooking his philosophical stances. In a way, everyone creates a version of Pessoa that fits their agenda, reflecting his own multitude, but possibly clouding the real person behind it all. These days, folks are debating whether Pessoa's rise to fame is due to genuine philosophical brilliance or just being interpreted the right way at the right moment. Did he really crack the codes of identity and consciousness, or is it just that the themes he wrote about are trendy again? Are we truly recognizing his timeless contribution, or are we just trying to fit him into today's context? Supporters of his enduring significance highlight that Pessoa took on age-old questions. How does our mind bring a bunch of parts together into a whole? What makes our sense of self stay steady while everything else changes? How do language and thought play off each other? Where exactly do imagination and reality meet? These questions aren't stuck in any one era. They're the kind that never really fade. Even if he didn't have all the answers, he provided a perspective that helps us dive into these puzzles, capturing the very core of the human experience. However, those on the skeptical side suggest our view of Pessoa shifts as our cultural and theoretical lenses change. Back when new criticism was all the buzz, focusing on how a work held together as a single entity, he didn't get much attention. But then, post-structuralism showed up, emphasizing the fragmented nature of meaning. All of a sudden, Pessoa seemed to fit perfectly. He appeals to postmodern tastes, but could just as easily be shrugged off if cultural priorities shift again. His influence hinges less on his work's inherent value and more on how it aligns with contemporary thought trends. Each era ends up crafting its own version of Pessoa, influenced by its own unique discussions. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Some of Pessoa's insights have lasting relevance. The notion that our identities aren't as seamless as we assume is still crucial. His exploration of how our minds can be fragmented yet function cohesively provides us with a peek into the complexities of our thoughts. The artistry involved in creating genuinely different literary personas from a single individual showcases our capacity for self-reinvention. These achievements remain significant over time, regardless of what's current in theoretical circles. Still, other aspects of his work haven't aged as gracefully. His spiritual reflections might seem outdated to today's audience. Even his fans might cringe at some of his political thoughts. His reclusiveness and unfinished projects come off more as obstacles rather than deep philosophical markers. His sparse published work appears less as a deliberate refusal to conform and more as a struggle with completion. The jumbled nature of his writings can strike some as a messy mind rather than a new literary form. Modern readers can learn from Pessoa, but trying to follow in his footsteps might be misguided. He was more of an inspiring illustration of creative potential than a template to be copied. Perhaps Pessoa's greatest legacy is the notion that literature and philosophy can blend seamlessly. He blurred the lines between different forms of writing, transforming his life and creative endeavors into a continual exploration of thought. He demonstrated that profound philosophical ideas might emerge through poetry, through imagined voices rather than strict logic, through the act of writing itself instead of structured argumentation. This opens up fresh avenues for practicing philosophy, contemplating questions, and expressing truths. Whether this leads to fruitful outcomes remains uncertain. However, the fact that Pessoa showed us this possibility is already a substantial gift. Part 9. Delving into Pessoa's work isn't exactly straightforward. Imagine sifting through 25,000 pages packed with half-baked writings, different drafts, and jumbled ideas. For researchers, the challenge is untangling what Pessoa genuinely believed from what was just playful experimentation. It boils down to figuring out whether his work was serious philosophy or just a bit of literary fun, a task that consistently ignites heated debates. The first major sticking point is understanding his heteronyms. Some scholars argue these were purely literary devices, fictional personas created to test out various philosophical concepts. They see Pessoa as an orchestrator of sorts, masterfully controlling these voices for artistic and intellectual experiments. They refer to his notes, where he intricately detailed the relationships, background stories, and interactions between these characters, to argue that he was fully in charge. Conversely, others propose that these heteronyms reflect multiple genuine personalities, akin to distinct mental states with their own autonomy. They cite an infamous anecdote where Pessoa claimed that a character named Cairo appeared spontaneously, spurring the creation of 30 poems seemingly out of nowhere. Pessoa insisted this process was involuntary. He was just as surprised by their actions as anyone else. Why is this important? It affects our philosophical interpretation of identity. If the heteronyms are mere inventions, Pessoa's work remains impressive, but it doesn't necessarily suggest that identities are layered and multifaceted. However, if these personas were indeed alternate identities, it adds credence to the idea that our sense of self is a complex, multifaceted narrative. Nowadays, many experts think it's a bit of both, a spontaneous emergence followed by intentional crafting. But this doesn't completely satisfy either camp. The next debate revolves around whether Pessoa was ahead of his time, aligned with postmodernism, or if his thoughts were still entrenched in older philosophical traditions. Those leaning towards postmodernism highlight his disruption of a unified self, his fragmented texts, and his rejection of absolute truths. They argue he introduced concepts later echoed by thinkers like Derrida and Baudrillard, embedding postmodern ideas before the term was even coined. However, some critics believe this perspective stretches the facts. They argue Pessoa operated within a different framework, distinct from what we recognize as postmodern. His interest in mysticism hinted at hidden truths, a contrast to postmodern relativism. His nationalism suggested a cohesive cultural identity, clashing with postmodern skepticism towards fixed identities. Moreover, his notions of authenticity, albeit paradoxical, don't align with postmodern disregard for authenticity. This alleged postmodern streak might result from isolating select ideas and ignoring those that don't fit. Some scholars suggest he had inklings of postmodernism but remained rooted in modern concepts, propelling further debate on categorizing his oeuvre. Finally, there's a debate about Pessoa's political ideology and its philosophical ties. Some point out contradictions in his political outlook. Critics highlight that although Pessoa initially seemed to sympathize with authoritarian regimes, he later criticized Salazar's dictatorship. They underscore how his advocacy for individualist anarchism contrasts sharply with his nationalistic fervor. The twist here is that during his lifetime, his political sway was minimal at best. It's argued that his philosophical embrace of multiple identities fundamentally clashed with his traditional political leanings, resulting in a mix that doesn't coalesce neatly. Thus, while his philosophical musings were quite progressive, they rubbed awkwardly against his old-school political stances. On one hand, Pessoa's political leanings felt like they were trapped in a time warp. Some conservative and nationalist scholars think that Pessoa's politics naturally spring from his philosophical musings. They argue that having a multitude of selves means you need some order. Otherwise, chaos will reign. If truth isn't a one-size-fits-all deal, finding common ground in a democracy gets tough. This idea of celebrating exceptional individuals can justify elitist politics. Plus, his mystical side favors spiritual knowledge over secular. To these scholars, Pessoa's politics don't clash with his philosophy. They stem from it. If you buy into his philosophical ideas, then his political views are part of the same package. Yet, other thinkers prefer to untangle his political and philosophical ideas, seeing value in the latter and viewing the former as personal errors. But doing so implies that someone could be razor-sharp on topics like identity, yet miss the bigger societal picture. While possible, it raises eyebrows. Maybe the bitter truth is that Pessoa's philosophical ideas might pave the way for reactionary politics, or, at the very least, don't put the brakes on them. Without a central guiding principle, having so many perspectives can devolve into a quest for power. Then there's the buzz around Pessoa's fascination with mysticism and esoteric stuff. Rationalists often shrug this off as quirky life details that don't reflect on his literary brilliance. They claim you can dig his poetry and prose without subscribing to astrology or secret societies. To them, mysticism is more of an add-on, stemming from Pessoa's time rather than being central to his genius. Others counter this view, arguing that mysticism is the foundation of Pessoa's work. They say you can't truly get his alter egos, or heteronyms, without that mystical lens, where layers of reality blur and hidden truths shine through symbols. Strip away the esoteric, and you're left with just another modernist. His appeal, they contend, lies in weaving new literary styles with mystical elements, mixing sharp philosophy with gut instincts. Recently, folks are re-examining his mystical side, pondering whether scholars should immerse themselves in his worldview or dismiss it as irrational. Can you really grasp Pessoa's essence without engaging with his beliefs? Or does true understanding require adopting a perspective far from today's logical secular norms? Finally, there's chatter about Pessoa's psychological landscape. Some scholars think his creation of multiple identities hints at some dissociative issues, rather than just philosophical depth or a literary gimmick. They point to his isolation, difficulty with relationships, indecisiveness, and extreme focus on work as signs of something amiss. They advise against idolizing Pessoa if it means romanticizing mental struggles. Yet others resist psychoanalyzing historical figures, calling it overly simplistic. They remind us that Pessoa held steady jobs, made friends, and produced a huge body of work. To them, deviation from the norm doesn't automatically spell trouble. Pessoa ventured into the depths of consciousness that most people usually avoid. It's not about having mental health issues, it's about being philosophically bold. Calling these unusual cases mental disorders just sets a standard for what's normal and dismisses original ideas as mere conditions. We're probably never going to settle this argument, as we don't have the means to actually look inside Pessoa's mind, and today's methods for diagnosing don't really mesh well with figures from the past. However, this does bring up important questions about how genius and madness could be intertwined, how creativity might coexist with dysfunction, and the delicate balance between deep philosophical thought and psychological turmoil. It's possible that Pessoa was both a genius and somewhat troubled, with his brilliance being tied to whatever was happening inside his head. Another topic up for discussion is whether an author aims to communicate specific meanings and if readers are able to grasp them. But when it comes to Pessoa, who created numerous author personas, pinpointing a single meaning is difficult. For instance, when Cairo, one of his heteronyms, wrote, "To think is not to understand," is that Cairo's viewpoint? Is it Pessoa's own belief? Or perhaps an interpretation that's challenging or critiquing what he believed? It's hard to say. This leaves the text floating in a kind of interpretive uncertainty because there's no singular author's intention to guide us. Some experts argue this gives readers the freedom to find their own meanings, while others see it as a dilemma for criticism, suggesting it reduces analysis to personal opinion. This ties into larger debates in literary theory about where meaning truly resides. Is it within the text, the authors, the readers, or the communities that interpret them? Then there's the matter of where Pessoa stands among philosophers. Is he a philosopher wielding the tools of a writer, or a writer dabbling in philosophical thinking? Philosophers tend to overlook him, considering his work mainly literary. Literary experts, on the other hand, delve into his writings but often sideline the philosophical aspects, viewing them as merely poetic themes. So, Pessoa ends up straddling a line, not fully embraced by either side. Some insist he was indeed a genuine philosopher, though with a literary twist on his insights and methods. Others argue that philosophy and literature are different spheres, contending that his lack of systematic argumentation disqualifies him, regardless of the depth of his thoughts. This reflects ongoing debates about whether philosophy needs to be structured, if literary works can genuinely be philosophical, or if poetic and philosophical truths are inherently different. Another perspective to consider is how Pessoa's work is translated and interpreted, given that he mainly wrote in Portuguese, but also in English and some in French. His writings in Portuguese have a complexity and playfulness that's challenging to translate into other languages. Different translators emphasize different aspects of his work in English, meaning that readers who encounter his translated works have a different experience than those reading the original Portuguese. This raises questions about how much his global reputation relies on the quality and decisions of translators, and whether people who don't speak Portuguese can fully grasp Pessoa. It also intersects with arguments about the significance of historical and cultural context, as Pessoa's work is deeply connected to early 20th century Portuguese life. International readers often miss this context, interpreting him as addressing universal themes rather than specific ones. Portuguese academics sometimes argue that his global reception makes him seem more postmodern and expansive than he actually was, obscuring his deep roots in Portuguese identity. The debates surrounding Pessoa are probably going to keep going because his work defies a single, definitive interpretation. He purposefully created his pieces with multiple perspectives, often leaving them incomplete and letting editors take care of publishing them after he passed away, blending bits that seemed mismatched. This resulted in a perpetual state of interpretive ambiguity. There isn't a single reading that captures the entire story, and any critique can be argued against. This method perfectly matches his appreciation for diversity and his rejection of singular interpretations. Trying to pin down one definitive meaning in Pessoa's work is next to impossible, because he was a complex and layered person. The discussions and debates are the very way to interact with the writings of someone who fully embraced the concept of multiplicity. Part 10. Let's chat about where Pessoa's worldview starts to stumble and reveal its flaws. It's kinda crucial to know where his genius insights shift to ideas that just plain fall apart. Think of it like a puzzle with some pieces fitting nicely and others, well, not so much. To begin with, his thoughts seem great on paper, but when you try living according to them, that's a whole other story. His concepts about splitting identities and tossing aside the notion of a singular self, along with valuing imagination over reality, might come off as profound, but in practice, it's a recipe for chaos. Take Pessoa as a case in point. He hardly got his works published, wasn't close to anyone, and ended up with a short life due to cirrhosis. These aren't just random mishaps. They're almost the logical outcomes of living by his philosophies. Think about the dilemma of making decisions. If you're made up of multiple fragments, choosing a life path turns into a nightmare. Making decisions means you're banking on the you, making the decision hanging around long enough to experience the results. But if the you making that choice isn't likely to be the you facing the consequences, why even bother? Pessoa captured this in his writing but didn't solve it. His solution: dodge major choices and drift along, leaving projects half done. That's not sage wisdom. It's more like giving up. Then there's the issue of isolation. If your mind reigns supreme over reality, what's the use in dealing with other people? People seem more like projections, no? So, Pessoa lived like this, keeping to himself, while his relationships were more like experiments than genuine interactions. In his writings, like the Book of Disquiet, his protagonist works among people but barely notices them. Those he mentions come off more as props than actual individuals with their own thoughts. That's the essence of solipsism, believing only your mind is real. If you go too far down that path, ethics crumble since others become mere hypotheticals, not real beings with rights. Another problem is seeing things through to the end. If dreaming about success feels more authentic than achieving it, why push to finish anything? Why bother to complete a project when the in-your-head version is already perfect? This attitude left Pessoa with heaps of unfinished works. His approach basically stifles productivity, unable to even fully articulate its own concepts. So, if your philosophy can't sustain itself, it collapses in on itself. Then there's the tricky part: communication. For talking to actually work, we need shared meanings. But if your identity and thoughts keep shifting, then communication is more a shot in the dark than a meaningful interaction. You might get words down, but whether they convey what you meant, who knows? Pessoa's writing is full of this, beautifully crafted but open to various interpretations, colored by the reader's perspective. Some label it rich, but honestly, it's a failing. Because if you can't make your message clear, it's like speaking a private language no one else gets. And this spills over into responsibility. Our laws expect people to face the music for their actions, screw up, and the same you gets the repercussions. But Pessoa's fragmented self-concept disrupts this too. If who we are keeps changing, then responsibility kinda loses meaning. Picture doing something, and then, by the time it backfires, you're not even the same person to deal with it. That's not just an abstract idea. Pessoa, for instance, avoided commitments and let folks down because he genuinely felt like the future him was a whole different person who'd have to clean up any messes. If you toss out responsibility, you pretty much nix ethics along with it. There's this tricky bit with values. If everything just boils down to how we see things and what they mean to us personally, who's to say what's good or bad, true or false, beautiful or ugly? Pessoa's perspective treats all viewpoints as valid because they're just different perspectives. But that approach would throw us into chaos. Claiming all perspectives have merit needs some kind of justification. Otherwise, if every standard is just another viewpoint, we're stuck in a loop. Honestly, the whole idea kind of falls apart upon closer inspection. Then there's the issue of figuring out which beliefs are legit. Without logical or scientific proof, how can anyone tell if an idea is right or just a delusion? Most of Pessoa's astrological predictions ended up being wrong, and his predictions of Portugal's future greatness didn't hit the mark either. Yet he held on to them, thinking that mystical knowledge didn't require conventional proof. But if you can't nail down any evidence, you might end up accepting anything, and that's more about wishful thinking than true wisdom. Now, on the political end, Pessoa's thoughts can veer worryingly towards authoritarianism or nihilism. If there's no objective truth, only power might decide who's right. Without a stable identity, accountability goes out the window. If some people are seen as more spiritually advanced, democracy gets sidelined. And if you believe a nation's destiny is mystically predetermined, who needs evidence? Pessoa's political leanings showed these views. He was into dictatorship, didn't care much for democracy, and believed in spiritual elitism and nationalist ideas. This wasn't just some random mistake. It fits right in with his overall philosophy. From a mental health perspective, Pessoa's ideas echo what you might see in dissociative disorders. Having trouble crafting a unified self, getting lost in fantasies, fragmenting your identity, and ending up in solitude seem more like signs of a struggle than groundbreaking philosophy. While he was undoubtedly smart, it's misguided to equate that intelligence with being mentally sound or wise. Looking at the academic angle, even though Pessoa aimed for philosophical heights, the world of professional philosophers largely ignored him. He hasn't made it into the standard course materials, isn't mentioned in philosophical histories, and isn't in key reference texts. Philosophers don't really see him as part of their circle because he didn't play by the discipline's rules. There's no structured argument, logical depth, engagement with existing philosophical works, or clear stances to analyze. He was more of a literary genius than a philosophical heavyweight. That, in itself, says a lot. Then there's the whole prediction game, which also didn't pan out. Pessoa had these grand visions of Portugal leading some global spiritual revolution and the rise of the Portuguese language, along with predicting societal changes through astrology. None of that stuff came to pass. After his time, Portugal's influence dwindled, lost its colonies, and the spiritual empire he foresaw just never came about. Despite all this, Pessoa still banked on these predictions to prove his philosophical points. When predictions flop, it usually hints that the thinking behind them might be off. Insights from modern cognitive science back this up. Today's studies on consciousness, identity, and memory don't really align with what Pessoa was pitching. Our sense of self is kept intact by ongoing brain activity. Memory helps weave our life stories together. On the flip side, multiple personality disorder is a problem precisely because this normal integration breaks down. Our brains create a cohesive sense of self by getting various parts to work in sync. It seems like Pessoa's philosophy is more about oddities than typical thought processes. Making sweeping statements about identity based on his experiences might be stretching things a bit. When it comes to talking about Pessoa's philosophy, there's a lot of confusion in the academic world. You'd think that if his ideas were clear-cut and right, scholars would all be on the same page. But that's not the case. There's a lot of debate. People can't agree on what he really believed in, whether he was being serious or just playing around, how to properly understand his writing, and which parts are significant and which aren't. Instead of this leading to a deeper understanding, it's just a big mess, suggesting his writings might not really have a straightforward meaning. Good philosophy is usually understandable enough for others to engage with and critique, but Pessoa's deliberate vagueness and multifaceted views make this challenging. Looking at the existential angle of things, it hits home pretty hard. Pessoa's actual life was not smooth sailing. He didn't get much attention when he was alive, didn't build any lasting relationships, wasn't known for any major completed works, and when he died, it was in relative obscurity. His supposed last words seem to express doubt about what's to come. This doesn't sound like a guy who stumbled upon some profound truth and lived it out. It seems like his philosophy made his existence tougher. Ideally, a philosophy should help you live well, maybe even happily. But at its best, Pessoa's might have only led to a kind of productive struggle rather than flourishing. Historically, many philosophers thought that philosophy should make you happier, wise, and virtuous. But for Pessoa, it just seemed to leave him feeling lonely, trapped, and leaning on alcohol. However, saying Pessoa's philosophy is a complete failure doesn't tell the whole story. Failures can be educational. He really pushed philosophical ideas to their breaking points and realized they don't always hold up. This is important because it shows us what not to do. His life's events demonstrate that being endlessly skeptical of yourself, fully giving in to fantasy, and denying all sense of unity is a dead end. There's a kind of wisdom in going to these extremes, even if it's more of a cautionary tale. The trick now is to see if we can take what he learned and avoid his pitfalls. Can we recognize that our identities are partly built without falling apart? Can we appreciate the complexities of our minds while still valuing some sense of cohesion? Can we treasure imagination but remain realistic? Accept diverse perspectives yet still commit to some? Maybe Pessoa's misjudgments indicate his insights aren't wrong. They're just hazardous and need to be handled with care. It's possible that some truths might be psychologically harmful, a heavy burden on the spirit, or cause trouble in daily life despite being true. Maybe our sense of self is a construct, but we need that fantasy to manage our day-to-day lives. Perhaps our identities are many-faceted, but we have to act as if they're unified to keep going. Our consciousness might be all over the place, but we have to pull it together to function. This sets up a bit of a tragic view of Pessoa. He perhaps uncovered some truths that became his undoing. Maybe he was on point about the nature of things, but slipped up by facing them too head-on. It's a bit like staring directly at the sun. Too much self-awareness can blind and harm you. Ironically, Pessoa's own life story kind of illustrates that his philosophy doesn't stand up to scrutiny. If it led to a troubled personal life, then surely it's missing some vital pieces, the stuff that makes life truly valuable, like believing in the story of a unified self, having a stable identity, engaging with the world around us, being able to take action, and finding meaning in our choices. Pessoa dismantled these comforting illusions in his head only to realize that you can't really live life without them. What he left behind wasn't a philosophy to live by, but rather a line marking how far we should go. You can go this far, but don't push past it. Understand things to a point, but know when to stop. Question your identity, but maintain a little constancy. Appreciate your many sides, but cling to a sense of wholeness. Value dreams and imagination, but stay rooted in reality. Pessoa's writing reveals the thin line where clear thinking starts to blur into confusion, and diving too deep into thought can make you feel lost. He illustrates exactly where that point is because he crossed it himself. We should look at his journey as a warning rather than a path to follow. Essentially, his work serves more as a heads-up than a guide.